Warriors of Old Japan and Other Stories by Theodora Ozaki. Part 2. Gen Sanmi Yorimasa, The Knight. Long, long ago, in Japan, there lived a brave knight named Gen Sanmi Yorimasa. Yorimasa was his own name, while Gen was a great clan to which he belonged. The Genji, or Minamoto, famous in history, and Sanmi showed that he was a knight of the third rank at court, from the word san, which means 3. Now, Yorimasa is so celebrated a warrior that to this day his picture is painted on the kites which the little boys of Japan fly at the New Year. And if you visit the temple of the Goddess of Mercy at Asakasa in Tokyo, you will see his portrait even there. And at the Boys' Festival on the 5th of the 5th month, when in every household where there are sons, the favourite heroes of the land are set out on their alcove of honour of the guest room, you will surely find amidst the martial show of toys the figure of an archer, clothed from head to foot in gay armour, with a huge bow in his hand and a quiver full of arrows on his back. That is Yorimasa, of brave and dear memory. Yorimasa was the 5th descendant of the great knight Raiko, who killed the demons of Oyeyama, about whom you will soon hear. As a youth, Yorimasa was noted for his valour and his skill in archery, and he was soon called to the court and given the important post of chief guard of the imperial palace. Now, though Yorimasa was a man of ability and the greatest archer of his time, and though he had done deeds of note which had brought him into prominence, yet for some unaccountable reason his rank at court remained stationary, and he did not advance from the 4th degree, Shi'i, which he had when he first entered the sacred precincts of the palace. The humour of the situation caught Yorimasa's fancy, for he was very quick-witted, and one day, smiling to himself, he sat down at his writing table and composed a poem lamenting his bad luck. From the earliest ages, the Japanese have trained themselves at the times when their feelings are stirred by some event which causes happiness or sorrow or disappointment, not to give way to their emotions, but to control their minds sufficiently to compose a poem on the subject. Yorimasa's poem was of 31 syllables, and in 5 short lines he said gracefully that one who has not the means of climbing upwards remains under the tree and passes his life in picking up beech nuts. Now, in Japanese, the word for beech nuts is shi'i, and the word also means the 4th rank at court, so that the couplet was a pun on his not being promoted. Yorimasa read the poem laughingly to some of his friends, and they, admiring his wit, repeated it and talked about it till it became quite famous in the palace, and at last reached the emperor's ear. The sympathy of His Majesty was aroused, and soon after this, Yorimasa was raised to the rank of the 3rd degree, Sanmi, and by this title he has ever afterwards been known. Now it happened that at this time the emperor became ill and could not sleep at night. He complained of a disturbance and a great sense of oppression from sunset to sunrise. His courtiers, full of anxiety, sat up to watch the night through to see if they could discover the cause of the emperor's agitation. Some kept vigil in and around the imperial chamber, others on the wide-eaved verandas, and some in the courtyard of the palace. Then the watchers on the verandas and in the courtyard noticed that as soon as the sun set, a black cloud came from the eastern horizon of the capital and, travelling across the city, finally rested on the roof of the palace called the Purple Hall, Shishinden, of the North Star where the emperor slept. As soon as this cloud alighted on the palace, the emperor's sleep became disturbed, as if by frightful nightmare. Those in attendance round the royal bed heard strange scratchings and noises on the roof, as if some dreadful beast were there. These unusual sounds and the nightmare of the imperial sleeper lasted till dawn, when it was noticed that the black cloud always withdrew. Now, in the palace, there was great commotion. The minister of the right and the minister of the left, whose duty it was to guard the emperor from all harm, held long and anxious consultation as to what should be done. Everyone in the palace was of the opinion that the black cloud hid some monster for which some unknown cause haunted the emperor. It was quite certain that unless the monster were killed, and that soon, the emperor's life would be endangered, for he was growing weaker and thinner every day. The question was, who was brave enough to undertake the task? The palace sentinels were already scared, so it was useless to expect help from them. The ministers must seek for some brave samurai, well known for his daring and his skill as an archer, and put him on night duty, charging him to kill the monster as soon as it should appear. The courtiers, one and all, said that Yorimasa was the man. An imperial messenger was therefore at once sent to the knight with a letter telling him what was demanded of him. Yorimasa, when he read the letter, looked very grave, for he felt the responsibility of his new duty, which was different from all other work, for on him now depended the recovery of the emperor, who was visibly growing worse and living through each day in terror of the nightmare which haunted him in the darkness. Yorimasa was a man of great courage and resource, and lost not a moment in getting ready. He strung his best bow most carefully and placed his quiver in 2 steel-headed arrows. He then put on his armour, and over his armour he donned a hunting dress, and to look more courtly he put on a ceremonial cap instead of a helmet. He chose his favourite retainer, the bravest and the strongest of all his soldiers, to accompany him. Yorimasa now set out as calmly and quietly as if he was simply going to his everyday duty and nothing more. As soon as his arrival was made known, he was summoned to the presence of the ministers of the right and the left and told all of what was happening in court, how every night, at the hour of sunset, a black cloud was seen to issue from the east, approach the palace, and finally cover the roof of the Purple Hall of the North Star, where the emperor always slept. Then the ministers told the knight of the strange noises that were heard on the roof, of the howlings and scratchings which lasted all night till the dawn broke. It behooved him, they said, to do his best to kill the monster, if such it was, for all the guards were now thoroughly frightened, and none of them dared attack it in hand-to-hand fight, and none had skill enough to hit it in the dark, even though the Emperor's own bodyguard of archers had tried again and again. Yorimasa listened to the strange story gravely. He saw that the whole palace was in a state of alarm and disturbance, but he did not lose heart. With the greatest self-possession, he waited for the end of the day. As soon as the sun set, the night grew stormy, the wind blew a hurricane, the lightning flashed and the thunder roared. Nothing daunted by the fury of the elements, the brave archer waited and waited. It must have been near midnight when Yorimasa saw a thick black cloud sweep down and settle on the roof of the palace. He bade his retainer be ready with sword and torch at any moment and to follow him closely. The black cloud moved along the ridge of the grey-tiled roof till it stopped at the northeast corner, just over the imperial sleeping chamber. Yorimasa cautiously followed the movements of the cloud, his man just behind him. Straining his eyes, Yorimasa saw, during a vivid flash of lightning, the form of a large animal. Keeping his eyes on the spot where he had seen the head, while the peals of thunder crashed like cannon above, in the darkness which followed, he caught the glare, first of one eye, and then of the other as the creature moved along. "This must be the monster who disturbs the Emperor's rest," said Yorimasa to himself. With these words, he fitted an arrow to the bow and, aiming to the left of where he saw the left eye glare, he pulled his bow as round as the full moon and let fly. Yorimasa felt that his arrow had touched flesh. At the same moment there was a frightful howl and a heavy thud, and the writhing in agony of some animal on the ground, which showed that Yorimasa had done his work well. Now, Yorimasa's retainer rushed upon the monster. In one hand he held a blazing torch, in the other a short sword, with which he stabbed the creature 9 times and quickly dispatched him. Then they both raised their voices and called to the sentinels and the courtiers to come and look. A strange sight was in store for them. Never had any of them seen anything like the monster that lay before them. The dreadful beast was as large as a horse. It had the head of an ape, the body and claws of a tiger, the tail of a serpent, the wings of a bird, and the scales of a dragon. They had heard and read of such creatures in some of the old books, but had always thought that such stories were old women's fables to be told and whispered by grey-haired dames around the hibachi, fire brazier, to their wonder-struck children, but never to be entertained seriously by men of sense. For a few moments they were all struck dumb with astonishment. They gazed silently first at the strange and horrible beast before them, then at Yorimasa, the slayer of it. Exclamations of wonder burst from their lips. Then one and all turned to the brave archer and congratulated him on his wonderful feat, his courage and his marksmanship. It seemed as if they would never cease applauding him. The animal was flayed and its skin was carried to the Emperor, who ordered it to be stored as a curiosity in the imperial treasure house. His Majesty was highly pleased, he sent for Yorimasa and bestowed on him a sword called Shishiwo, or the King of Lions. The time of the year was the beginning of the 5th month. The crescent moon hung like a silver bow in the twilight sky, and the cuckoo was calling from the trees nearby. So the minister of the left, who handed the sword to Yorimasa, improvised the first half of a stanza saying, "O cuckoo of wonder, even your name climbs ever upward to the heaven." Then Yorimasa, on his knees with uplifted hands and bowed head, received the sword, and as he did so he completed the short poem with these words, "Not thou thine own, but through the merit of the moon-shaped bow." The minister used the cuckoo, then calling in the trees, as a simile of the brave warrior, whose fame was rising now at court because of his brave deeds, and Yorimasa modestly answered that all was not due to his skill but to his bow, which he likened to the crescent moon then reigning in the sky. Both turned to the scenery of the moment for inspiration, the minister in expressing his praise, and the warrior in receiving it with becoming humility and grace. The emperor also considered this a fitting occasion to give Yorimasa the Lady Ayami, which means iris, for his wife. And about this incident there is a pretty story. The Lady Ayami was the most lovely lady in waiting in the palace, and as good as she was beautiful. Not only in beauty but in mind and heart. She was superior to all the other ladies in waiting, and both the emperor and the empress held her in high esteem. Many were the court nobles who fell in love with her, but all in vain. There was not one, however great or rich or handsome, who could make her so much as grant him even a fleeting smile. Time after time these noble suitors wrote her letters and poems, telling of their hopeless love and beseeching her to send them but a single line in reply. But only her silence answered them. She remained obdurate to all entreaties. One day Yorimasa, when on duty in the palace, caught a passing glimpse of the Lady Ayami, and from that hour his heart knew no rest. He could not forget the witching grace nor the modest beauty of her lovely face. Sleeping or waking, the vision of his lady love was always before his eyes, and it seemed to grow more vivid as the days went by. Time after time he wrote her letters and composed poems asking her to marry him, but the Lady Ayami treated Yorimasa as she treated all her other wooers. She vouchsafed him no reply. For 3 long years Yorimasa waited and hoped and despaired, and waited and hoped again, content if once in a way from a respectful distance he should catch a glimpse of her. In spite of a long and cold discouragement, he loved her perseveringly. The emperor had heard of the knight's constancy, and now sent for his favourite lady in waiting, thinking this the right time to reward Yorimasa's prowess and the Lady Ayami's merit, and to make them both happy. As soon as Ayami appeared, His Majesty said, "Lady Ayami, is it true you have received many letters from the knight Yorimasa? Is it so?" At this, the Lady Ayami blushed like a peach blossom in the glow of dawn, and, hesitating a moment, she replied, "May it please the Son of Heaven to condescend to send for Yorimasa and ask him." His Majesty then commanded her to retire, and forthwith summoned Yorimasa to his presence. It was the 5th of May, the spring festival, and Yorimasa came robed in gala attire. He presented himself below the dais on which the emperor was seated and prostrated himself before the throne. "Is it true," and the emperor smiled as he spoke, "that you love the Lady Ayame?" Yorimasa was bewildered by the suddenness of the question and knew not what to reply, for he knew it to be strictly forbidden by court etiquette to write love letters to any lady in waiting, and he had done this persistently. Now the emperor saw Yorimasa's confusion and felt sorry for him. A bright thought struck his majesty. He would please and puzzle Yorimasa and have some fun at his expense at the same time as well. He whispered an order to the chief master of ceremony. In a short time, 3 ladies appeared, heralded by attendants. As they moved across the mats of the immense hall, Yorimasa saw that they were all dressed exactly alike, and that even their hair was done in the same style, so that it would be impossible for anyone who did not know them well to distinguish one from the other. Who were they? Was the Lady Ayame one of them? Like maidens of heaven, Tenin, did the 3 noble damsels appear, and their robes were beautiful to behold. So alike were they, and their beauty so extraordinary, that Yorimasa compared them to plum blossoms on a branch seen through a window. "The Lady Ayame is here," said the emperor. "Choose her from among 3 ladies and take her." Yorimasa bowed to the ground. He was overcome with the graciousness and kindness of the emperor, but the task laid upon him he felt to be too difficult. Being a military man and inferior in rank to the court circle, Yorimasa had never had an opportunity of seeing any of the court ladies face to face. All he had seen of the Lady Ayame was sometimes a glimpse of her from the courtyard where he was stationed. As she passed along the corridors of the palace, once at a poetical party to which he had been admitted as a great favour, he had seen her, at the further end of the hall, glide with trailing robes of ceremony to her place behind the silken screen which always hid the women from view at such gatherings. That was all he had ever seen of her, so that now he could not distinguish her from the rest. The emperor was pleased at the success of his pleasantry. He saw that Yorimasa was fairly perplexed, and that he was unable to pick out his lady love from her companions. "I am a soldier and not a courtier," thought the knight. "I may not presume to lift my eyes to a lady above the clouds, nor can I be sure which is Ayame. Were I to make a mistake and choose the wrong lady, it would be a lifelong disgrace and disappointing to me." The perplexity in his mind at once rose to his lips in the form of a short poem, which he repeated. "In the rainy season, when the waters overflow the banks of the lake, who can gather the iris?" Such is the meaning of the verse. By the rainy season, Yorimasa meant his 3 years of hopeless courting, during which his eyes had become dim with tears of disappointment he had shed, so that he could no longer see clearly enough to discover which was the lady of his choice. In this way he excused himself for his seeming stupidity, and showed a modest reserve which pleased all present. The aptness and quickness of Yorimasa's verse won the emperor's admiration. The tears stood in the august eyes, for he thought of the great love wherewith Yorimasa had loved the Lady Iris, and of the sorrow and patience of his long wooing and waiting. His Majesty rose from his throne, descended the steps of the dais, and going up to Ayame, took her by the hand and led her forth to Yorimasa. "This is the Lady Ayame. I give her to you," were the golden words of the emperor. To Yorimasa, it must have seemed too wonderful almost to be true. The great desire of his life was given him by the emperor himself. Then Yorimasa led his beautiful lady love away and married her, and we are told that they lived as happily as fish in water, and it seems as if they had but one heart between them, so harmonious was their union. In the palace there was great rejoicing over the auspicious event, and all the courtiers praised the merit of the verse which had finally given Ayame to Yorimasa and won the emperor's special commendation. The happy couple received the congratulations of the emperor and empress, of the courtiers and many noble people, and wedding presents innumerable. Surely at this time there was no one happier than Yorimasa in all the land. There are many stories told of Yorimasa, which show us that he was not only a brave soldier and a man of learning and a poet, but also a man of wit and tact who knew how to use men as he willed. Now, one day a band of discontented, turbulent priests came to the palace gate where Yorimasa was on guard and demanded entrance. It must be explained that in those days the Buddhist priests of Kyoto were a set of wild and lawless men who often brought shame to their religion by their wicked lives. They lived outside the city on Mount Hiei, which they made their stronghold, and, forgetting the dignity of their religion, they took sides in war and politics. They gave trouble to those in authority, especially those who did not favour them. They used the smallest event as an occasion for carrying swords and bows and arrows, and it was in their habit to go out equipped like soldiers going forth to war. Yorimasa saw that the priests were all well armed and only too anxious to find a pretext for drawing their swords. They carried with them in great state the sacred palanquin of their temple. In this palanquin their patron god was supposed to dwell, and it was borne aloft on the shoulders of 50 men. With loud shoutings and a wild display of strength, the priests rushed the car along, now lifting it high above their heads, now staggering under its weight, as it seemed about to crush them to the ground. Now, Yorimasa was in no mood for fighting that day, and it seemed to him not worth his while to set his men, the best fighters and the archers of the realm, against a handful of priests, whom he could disperse in a few minutes. Besides, these priests from Mount Hiei were troublesome fellows, and he did not wish to earn their enmity. So, laughing quietly to himself, he said they would have some fun at their expense. When the procession stopped opposite the gate, Yorimasa, with his captains of the guard, sallied forth to meet the noisy crowd, and coming in front of the palanquin, bowed in reverence before it with a slow ceremony. The priests, who expected and were prepared for a very different or difficult reception, were surprised and somewhat taken aback. After some parley amongst themselves, the spokesman advanced and asked leave to enter the gate, saying they had a petition to present the emperor. Yorimasa sent his captain forward. "My lord bids you welcome," he said, "and wishes me to say that he worships the same gods as yourself, and he is therefore adverse to shooting against the Mikoshi," sacred palanquin, "with his bows and arrows. Besides this, we are very few in number, so that your names will be dishonored, and you will be called cowards for having chosen the weakest post to fight. Now, the next gate is guarded by the Heiki soldier, who are much stronger in numbers than we are. How would it do for you to go around and fight there? You would surely gain glory in an encounter with them." The priests were so pleased by the flattery of this speech that they did not see that it was a ruse on the part of Yorimasa to get rid of them easily, and that he was sending them round to bother his rivals. He had also appealed to their best feelings, for Japanese chivalry teaches that in the event of choosing between two enemies, the weaker must always be spared. Some polite answer was made to Yorimasa, and the priests shouldered the mikoshi and departed in the same spirited and vociferous manner that they had come. They went to the next gate, guarded by the heike. Battle was given at once, for they were refused admittance. The priests were beaten and fled for their lives to the hills. All these stories show us that Yorimasa was a clever man in every way, but in the end he was unfortunate, and for this there was no help. When we read the story of his ill-fated death, our hearts are filled with sorrow for him. It is not always as one wishes in this world, and Yorimasa did not meet with the fate his meritorious deeds and character deserved. The Heike, or Taira clan, were now in the ascendant. Yorimasa, it will be remembered, belonged to the Genji, or Minamoto, and Kiyomori, their despotic and unprincipled leader, was Prime Minister. All the important posts in the government he gave to his sons, grandsons, and relations, who under these circumstances, seeing that they owed everything to him, did just as the tyrant ordered. All samurai who did not belong to the Heike clan he treated unjustly, even throwing those he did not like into prison, whether they were innocent or guilty of the crimes, or behaviour deserving such a punishment. As a general of the rival Genji clan, Yorimasa suffered much from this unfair treatment. As he watched the arrogant conduct of Kiyomori and his son Munemori, he longed to be able to punish them and to bring retribution on the whole clan, and to this end he thought and worked and planned. At last, the Heike became so overbearing and so powerful that their actions passed the bounds of all reason, and Kiyomori, on a question of succession to the throne, confined the reigning emperor in his palace. This last step was too much for Yorimasa. He could endure this state of things no longer, and he resolved to make a bold strike for the right. He placed Prince Takakura, the son of the late emperor, at the head of his army and set out to do battle with the Heike. But the Genji were far inferior in numbers to the Heike, and sad to relate, Yorimasa was defeated in his good and just cause. With the remainder of his army, he fled before the enemy and took refuge in the temple of Byodoin, situated on the river Uji. The Byodoin temple, a large edifice near Kyoto, remains to this day. Here, Yorimasa made a last stand to afford time for Prince Takakura to escape. He divided his men into two parties. One division he stationed as a reserve force on the grounds of the temple, while the other he drew up in battle array along the banks of the river. In case of pursuit, to prevent the enemy from crossing the river, they tore up the planks which formed the flooring of the bridge, so that only a skeleton of posts and crossbeams remained. Then they rested and waited to see what would happen. The Heike soon came in sight, followed hard after them. First came the generals, then the soldiers, 28,000 strong. They approached the bridge but stopped short when they saw what the Genji had cleverly done. In a few minutes they ranged themselves along the bank facing the enemy. Both armies now stood confronting each other on either side of the Uji. Simultaneously, the order was given to fight by both the Genji and the Heike generals, and a fierce discharge of arrows from both sides ensued. Then there rushed forth from the ranks of the Genji a huge priest, Taijima Bo, by name. In those days, the Buddhist priest often took part in battles. Brandishing an enormous halberd, he dashed alone on the skeleton bridge. Then Heike, thinking he had made an excellent target, shot a shower of arrows at him, but he was not in the least daunted. When the arrows were aimed at his head, he stooped and they passed over him. When they were aimed at his legs, he jumped high in the air and they flew under him. When they were aimed at his body, he swept them aside with his halberd, and in this way he escaped free from hurt. So quick was he in his movements, and so marvellous was the way in which he balanced himself in his progress across the bridge, that he seemed to be endowed with power more than human, and not only his own comrades, but the enemy also looked at him in breathless admiration. Then another of Yorimasa's men, also a priest, Jomyo by name, inspired by this example, came forth and stood up at the end of the bridge, and fitting his arrows to the bow in rapid succession, shot about a dozen at the foe in the twinkling of an eye, crying out, "Oh, this is too much trouble!" He threw away his bow and arrow and walked over the bridge on another beam, sweeping aside with his sword the arrows aimed at him. Yet another priest, famous for his great strength, dashed out and followed after his friend across the bridge. He soon came up with Jomyo, but as the beams of the bridge were narrow, he could not pass him. Stopping for a moment to think what he should do, he stretched out his hands and touched the helmet of the man just in front of him. Then, lightly and quickly jumped leapfrog over his head. The bridge was now soon swarming with the Genji, who, with fierce battle cries, began to attack the Heike, whose advance was entirely checked. For some minutes the Heike were greatly put out, not knowing what to do. Then one brave youth, seeing how matters stood and that it required someone to take a dauntless lead, sprang forth in front of the Heike and cried out, "Now that it comes to this, there is no other way!" And with these words he dashed his horse into the river. It was the rainy season and the waters were higher and the current stronger than usual. Black with mud, the river ran swirling and whirling on its course. Never was there a braver sight than when the young soldier drove his horse into the swollen river and made for the other side. His comrades could not stand still and watch him. Fired by his courage, numbers of the Heike, shouting, I also, dashed in after him. In a few minutes, while the Genji looked on in surprise, 300 men had followed the gallant young captain, stemmed and crossed the torrent and landed on the other side, and with the same dashing spirit carried everything before them. They broke through the last lines of the Genji and entered the Byodon temple, where their last stand was made. The Genji, with Yorimasa at their head, were now in a desperate condition. Seeing his father hard-pressed, Kanetsuna, Yorimasa's second son, an intrepid young knight, rushed into the thickest of the fight and tried to defend his father. A Heike captain, coming up with 15 of his men, seized Kanetsuna, overpowered him, and cut off his head. Not one of Yorimasa's little band turned to flee. Although they knew there was no hope, they fought on to face to face with the foe, for samurai tradition held it a disgrace to be even wounded in the back. One famous general in ancient history issued an order to the effect that prizes would be awarded to those who were shot in the forehead, but those who were wounded in the back should be slain. One by one, the Genji fell, silent, slain by either sword or arrow. Yorimasa received several wounds. Then he saw there was no use in fighting more. All was lost. Those of the Genji who were still left made a brave stand around their chief. While they kept the enemy at bay, Yorimasa slipped away and hastened to Prince Takakura in the temple and begged him to flee in safety while there was yet time. Having seen his imperial master safe, Yorimasa then retired to an inner part of the garden and, sitting under a large tree, drew out his sword and prepared himself to commit harikiri, for samurai honor would not let him survive defeat. Calling his retainer, Wanatanabe, who had escaped unhurt and who had never left his master's side, Yorimasa bade him act as second in the right. Then, quietly taking off his armor, he composed a poem. He likened himself to a fossil tree that never knows the joys of blossoming, for he had never attained his ambition, the destruction of his enemies. And sad indeed is the end of my life. The last line of the verse were the last words he uttered. He took out his short sword and, thrusting it into his side, died like a brave and gallant samurai without a moan. Then from behind, as was his duty as second, Wanatanabe cut off his master's head, and so that it should not be discovered by the enemy and carried away as a trophy of war, he tied a large stone to it and, with sorrowful reverence, dropped it into the river and watched it sink beneath the water out of sight. In this way died Yorimasa. Those of his followers who were not killed by the enemy died by their own hand, and Prince Takakura, fleeing to Nara, was overtaken by the Heike and put to death on the way. Yorimasa was 75 years of age when he died, though, as he lamented in his last poem, he had not achieved his ambition in punishing the Heike. Yet years later his work was carried on, and the Heike were completely exterminated by Yoritomo, the great chief and mighty avenger of the Genji, and the name of Gen Sanmi Yorimasa lives forever in the history of his country. End of Part 2. If you have been enjoying these audiobooks, please subscribe. That would really help the station. You may also leave a like or a comment or share these stories with your friends. Thank you.